What's up guys, Akariss here, bringing another Fire Emblem Heroes video. Today's video is the weapon refines of the May update. So some of you might be pretty excited with this batch. I'm fairly indifferent because none of these really affect me all too much. In my own way, I guess Duma maybe has the most impact, but there is quite a bit to talk about in this video, as of course we're going to be covering 6 different units and how they're all affected by the new buffs and upgrades that they have, well, have received now. So yeah, just a quick overview of things before we jump in. Just a reminder guys, all this content is supported by you guys over there. There is no sponsor except YouTube, Twitch, Patreon, and for those of you can actually sign up for coaching in the description below. Those are the only plugs I really do at the beginning of every single video, and I just want to let that out there for those of you that really want to give back to what I do. If you can't do anything, then even just watching this video and smashing the like button does help, and I appreciate all of you guys for doing that. Also, I do see all the comments, those of you that do engage with the discussions, that all helps, and I really am appreciating all that, and that's why I try to continue to do as much of these videos as I can, despite life being pretty good now, post-pandemic, and things are pretty comfy, safe, and pretty much back to normal. So I hope that you guys are also having some pretty comfy times, but it does mean that I'm trying to fit in as much of this video content as I can to keep you guys in the loop with my opinions, and of course, hopefully get you guys thinking about how these new units or how these upgrades can affect this stuff. Upcoming videos you guys can look forward to. So obviously the Shoju poll analysis video on the upcoming Fallen banner. I do have a reaction video which was like yesterday or the day before, I forgot. And there is as well a Morum video coming and a couple other things as well. For those of you that support the content, there will be a unit review video, and I'm going to also be covering Summoner Duels as well, as I am pretty much always top 100 or rank 1 in SDS, so I feel there is some strategies and tips I can give you guys. I'll try to keep that general because the meta in something like Summoner Duels is ever changing. It's like every 2 weeks, new map, new skills, new units. It's obviously a lot of design is done. New unit design is pushed towards Summoner Duels, but I still want to give you guys some tips, especially if you're coming from an F2P perspective, which I can hopefully help you guys understand or use. Okay folks, that's it for the beginning spiel. Let's jump into this Hall of Forms video. So, no, it's actually a weapon refine video, but nonetheless, I will keep it as is. I love to keep these videos one take. So, yeah, what I'm going to do in this video is going to be a slightly different format than what I used to do. I used to go through these one by one, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to talk about every unit individually and all its weapon refines at one by one, and then I'll cover builds in the second part of the video. So if you want to see below on the chapter tags of YouTube, you can skip ahead to your favorite unit. However, if you watch the whole video through, that does help the algorithms, and I do appreciate it again. If you just watch it through, maybe there's something you can learn or help others pass on that knowledge. So yeah, let's start with Felicia on the far left. I did cover Felicia a couple months ago when she was a Hall of Forms candidate, and that's where the Hall of Forms thing is coming from. And I said back then that I felt she was one of the best near save tanks. I still stand by that, and especially so past refine. So when it comes to like the best near save tanks, I honestly feel that speed is important, because with speed you avoid a lot of problem scenarios, especially now with someone like Legendary Nana existing, and Nana really does want to like double, and she just pierces through these special reduction type effects. So Hardy Fighter and Brave Erica existing, there's a lot of these melee units, and Brave Alm, basically Brave Alm, Brave Erica, and like Legendary Nana all give near save tanks a big problem, but if you end up outspeeding any of those threats, they become a lot less problematic, and therefore someone like Felicia, or obviously Lucina, Valentine's Lucina, or Emilia are all great near save tanks because they can push their speed as near save options, and that's why I think Felicia is in quite a good position. And as you see by the refine, that helps a little bit. She's not necessarily pushing speed like maybe some other refine might have done, but she does get quite a lot of bulk. She gets 4 to all stats from her just 25% HP base condition, and then another additional 4 to all stats, and a deny the enemy auto double effect, so like neutralize effect that guarantees foes follow-ups, plus a first attack 30% DR. This is kind of similar to like Savvy Fighter, so for those of you that did give her Savvy Fighter, that sucks a little bit, but Savvy Fighter does at least have some additional damage reduction, and it has a full null follow-up effect, so it does mean that someone like Felicia can at least guarantee her follow-up if the enemies are using stuff like Sturdy Impact, for example. So despite her being kind of competitive with Lucina, who obviously has future vision, and Amelia, I do think she's in quite a good spot. She's definitely better than Amelia, but not necessarily better than Lucina. They're both great, and you can't really go wrong, especially if you picked up the Hall of Forms, or you just happen to have extra copies and are considering building her. As I said, I'll go through builds near the end of the video, covering everyone, but what I want to focus on here is pushing through every unit one by one, giving my weapon refine opinions, and of course the stats. So Felicia is of course speed and res oriented, and that actually matters quite a bit because I do think those are great stats. The res is less important, but since all the checks are done through res, then that does help, again, quite a bit. So next up is Thea. This would be like the F2P option. Thea being, of course, like a 4-star unit. Probably many of you have copies of Thea, but Thea does come with Maltet. It's not exactly the same. She's not neutralizing her armor effectiveness on her, because obviously she's not an armor, but there's a lot going on in this weapon. It's effectively a Dragonflower weapon. I want to call Dragonflower weapons similar to like a mercenary weapon, where they're just the more flowers you give them, the more powerful they get. So there's a lot going on in here. To basically summarize all this, giving her max flowers benefits you quite a bit, and it's like 10 dragon flowers and then all the effects are activated, but I think she can go up to 15. Either way, you want to give her as many as possible. Not only does that help in her rolls that you might use for her, but she's also going to get all these additional effects. So one effect here is 10 dragon flowers. She gets a start of turn buff for 6 attack, 6 defense. That's nice. The other one is if she has no Dragon Flower, she gets 4 tall stats, but if you give her just a single one, then she gets 5 tall stats. That's what's expected, honestly. And then another one is a guard effect on the enemies if she has 5 or more Dragon Flowers. So she basically has a start of turn buff, 5 to all stats, and a guard effect, and this is all in the base effect weapon. Once you consider the refine effect, she has an additional 4 to all stats, which is within a 3 space condition of an ally, which is pretty generous, and then a bonus doubler effect on top of that. So any of the buffs she has, she gets even more. So as you can see, Thea is quite stat stacked, and in the builds that I'm going to show later, you'll see that I actually think she's in quite a good spot now. I feel like Thea is quite good, very stat heavy. So for any sort of tank role that you might give Thea, she's going to be quite good. And the fact that she has a guard in her weapon itself is, again, adding to the fact that as a tank unit, I think she'll excel exceptionally well. So for you Thea fans, this is actually quite a good weapon, and Maltet, I guess, continues the trend of being pretty good. So stats are nice, but the self-turn buffs and the guard effect really do accelerate this weapon into higher echelons of power, if you ask me. Alright, next up is our best friend Duma. This guy has been so back and forth in the meta, I honestly don't even know where to consider him anymore, as either a meme or not a meme, but I'm going to put him as pretty good now. He went from meme on release because defense mythics were kind of bad to slightly better, especially when you consider stuff like Bull Tower being relevant, and that's when it started getting upgrades and such. And of course, pre-Elamine, he was pretty good because, again, you could knock out a safety fence, catapults, that kind of stuff. Then Elamine happened, and of course, he kind of fell off again because they feel you can just counter his upheaval, and that just sucks. So now he has an upheaval upgrade. I covered that in the video for the update notif, but effectively that's a damage increase and a menace type effect for hitting buildings. Now, what's not said here is that the Aether, the fort, and the escape ladders are not considered in buildings. They're not. If they're in the same lane as Duma, he's going to actually just ignore them completely in his check. And this means he can actually hit 2 buildings. If the lane, his lane doesn't have a building, or it has a escape ladder, or it has a fort, he's going to hit the 2 nearest buildings to the side of that. So he can effectively hit 2 buildings now, and if you run a catapult, let's say on the other side of the map, you can hit like 3 buildings now. So this is crazy good. I think Duma's in a great spot. Once I go through the builds, I'll show you that you could get some consistency out of upheaval, or make use of this weapon refine, because this weapon refine is also a solid addition to Duma. He already has a high base attack, which is still relevant to this day, and most of the checks here are comparing that sort of thing. The more attack he gets, the stronger he's kind of benefiting from his effects. So what we're seeing down here is almost the same kind of stuff with the whole HP condition off his upheaval, but now on top of that, he also has a start of combat visible attack check as well. So even if he attacks into, let's say, something at full health, if his attack is higher than the enemy, and this isn't actually too difficult to do, then he's going to stop the enemy follow-up, which is great. It'll make him bulkier. On top of that, his refine effect creates a bigger discrepancy there. He's going to hit harder. He's going to get damage reduction if foes hit him on that first attack. So if they do end up going through his like faux first attack double, like denying the double, then he actually is going to deny some damage from the first hit, and then he'll be kind of vulnerable in the second. But on top of that, he also has like a moose spell attack versus res effect where he's just going to hit really hard. So Duma is a threat to be respected for sure. Upheaval is a lot better, and in general, Duma is probably quite a bit up there now when I'm talking about mythics. I would have considered him maybe like bottom tier with like Lif, pre-refined, but I think he's quite up there on the Anima Mythic list now, with like Mirabilis being really good, and probably Duma might be like right after him, or it could be, let's say, Odor, who's also a decent threat, but even Odor is a little bit weak to something like Elamine. Cyros is whatever as well. So like the Anima Mythics in general just aren't too good, so Duma really benefits from a change like this. Moving on though, let's go talk about the other three guys from the Weapon Refine list here. We have Idunn, and I do think IS really does love Idunn, but post-Refine, she's not really that much better. This is just a decent upgrade. Idunn was already kinda good even before this Refine. The weapon was nice, it was already neutralizing penalties, so you didn't have to use stuff like Slick Fighter or Unity skills. And now it's going to have an additional effect if foe initiates combat. So that's good, it's okay, it's not really that much of a base upgrade. The Refine is kind of interesting, but it does have some drawbacks. And the drawbacks are particularly that the foe has to make like a follow-up attack to get the DR, but she doesn't have a slaying weapon, so she can't really benefit from using stuff like Bonfire, let's say, as a special, and just nuking to kill before she gets that second hit. So this kind of encourages a sort of like crafty fighter type build or vengeful fighter type build where you're kind of likely taking 2 hits, or maybe using stuff like deflect magic or deflect missile. It's kind of awkward, and I don't really like it all too much, but it is still an upgrade over what she had. If I was to like go over these weapon refines, I'd say that Idunn is kind of ironically the weakest refine here, but the thing is, it's still an upgrade over what she was doing, and she was already really good, and she's still a great tank, so this is just straight up an upgrade over what Idunn was already doing. So yeah, not really amazing, but not really bad either. Let's go talk about Kaden here. So Kaden is actually, this text is translated incorrectly. His base effect got an attack and 5 speed upgrade for himself, but beyond that, he still has that like bonus doubler for friend type effect where his stats are transferred onto an ally, but the additional effect here on the refine is actually affecting the weapon. So in the second part here, it says if units within 2 space of an ally grants defense res 2 to unit during combat, inflicts special cooldown charge -1. That is translated incorrectly. It's been confirmed that he actually gives his allies defense res 2 and the guard effect. This is good because there's not too many type of effects in the game that can replicate this. I believe Tannin Baton on healers is the other one, with healer supports not being as good. So not only does Kaden end up ally supporting quite a bit, if you ally support, you use his weapon effect and this like defense res 2 kind of drive plus guard effect, he ends up being quite a good buffed omni tank in general. So those that don't use like stance skills can now get a guard effect through their allies with Kaden. So I think this is actually quite a good upgrade for Kaden, and anyone who was using Kaden previously as support is really going to benefit from this. Or if you're still using Omni tanks to this day, so let's say like Fjorm or something who has like a DC weapon or Legendary Ike or whatever, if you're using those sort of tanks, or even the new Young Ike, for example, those all benefit from Kaden being a support partner. So I think this is quite a good refine. At least it'll age pretty well unless we start getting all these supports with giving guard effects or dodge effects or something like that. Okay, and finally with Gharnef here. So with Gharnef, we have just upgrades to a small upgrade to his base effect, meaning he just gets like an attack speed 5 upgrade. That's not that interesting, but the refine is. So the refine effect is an easy condition for 25% HP. He gets attack speed 5, but any combat he has that is against non-magic foes, so anyone who's pretty much using physical damage, sword, lance, axe, dagger, and bow, then he's going to get a flat 30% DR. And that's quite good. It's not even a condition of res, it's not a condition of speed, nothing like that. He just gets 30% DR against enemies like that. But on top of that, he has a flash kind of wind sweep effect against those enemies. The DR is on either phase, and The condition of DR and Windsweep, unfortunately, is still against non-magic foes, but there is ways to make it more consistent, and I will show that in the builds as we're about to jump in, starting with Felicia, actually. So, let's get this started. I want to talk about Felicia again. We'll loop back to her weapon. It'll be right there. So Felicia, and I want to show off some of the fodder just to keep you guys aware, because sometimes you may not want to use these units and you may want to consider their fodder. When it comes to Felicia, thankfully Special Fighter is the only fodder she has. And if you needed some sort of near save tank, then I do think that it might just be worth merging her and giving her a bit of fodder. Those of you that picked up her Holo Forms will really benefit from this sort of thing. So as I mentioned previously with Felicia, I do think she is a great buff or potentially good candidate when it comes to near save tanks, because speed is king. So speed IV or res IV are both good IV options. Try to make use of whatever fodder you have, but what I would suggest doing is making sure you add, let's say, a guard effect through the stance skill, and again, Kaden might be a good support for this, and Slick Fighter, because she doesn't have an auto double up or ways to neutralize penalties. So when you build these armor units as near save or far save, you're trying to stack as many effects as you can. You want like your auto double, you want special acceleration through breath, you want like a guard effect, and stuff like DR as well if possible. So you're using like flame, deflects, hardy fighters, whatever type of effects you can just stack in there. That's how you make these great save tanks, whether it's near save or far save, and this is applicable to basically all of the tanks. So, as I said, just stack auto doubles, neutralize penalties, give guard effects, special acceleration. Those are all really good things to have, and that is how you're going to be building your units. Now, in Summoner Duels, when you're building Summoner Duels potential tanks, they all will be far save. Near save is unfortunately not very viable, if at all viable, in Summoner Duels. So I wanted to show you guys that if you do use Felicia, you could use the DR effect here on her first attack, and then not charge your special, which could be Aegis in this case, and benefit from DR on the first and second hit. Keep in mind though that the DR on the weapon will still get pierced by stuff like Deadeye and Lethality, so she will likely just die to Crom if Deadeye on him is proc, for example. So it's not super consistent. You might just be better off, let's say, pre-charging Sacred Cowl so that she might survive a dual Crom effect, or Deadeye rather. But yeah, so I don't know if she'd stack up being an amazing Summoner Duels or AR offense type unit, because dual Crom is quite relevant and Deadeye is still going to be quite good against her. But otherwise, it's still a buff, and Felicia users should be quite happy with what we end up having here. Next up are some builds for Thea. In terms of fodder, it's not really that relevant. She only has steady posture, nothing else notable, and plenty of you guys probably have fodder at this point. One of the most important things with Thea is making sure you have the Dragon Flowers to activate the multitude of effects on her weapon. Now, why I mentioned this earlier was I feel like Thea makes a solid Omni tank, or potentially just a melee tank. Now, if you're an Omni tank, it's quite good because she just has so much stats given to her in her weapon, but the thing she suffers from the most as an Omni tank is unfortunately like penalties. So without Unity, she's going to likely get hit by a bunch of penalties unless you can have one of your supports soak up the Bright Shrines, the Dark Shrines, or something like that. And that's going to be her biggest weakness, unfortunately, as an Omni tank. She's going to be really susceptible to something like Panic. But I do think those new Smoke 4 skills will make great Omni tanks relevant again. And Speed Smoke 4 is a great way to actually add speed damage reduction to a unit who's otherwise pretty speedy in the form of Thea. So huge defense and res, huge speed and attack makes her a solid Omni tank. You could honestly combine her with, again, supports like Male Corrin, or just in general units who can soak off. And that's going to be the big issue. Using Unity, taking off her debuffs, or just benefiting from it with like the melee tank on the build on the far left, combined with a far save, would be pretty consistent. Either way, Thea users will really enjoy this weapon. Finally, a third way you could use her is just as a Wings of Mercy Gale Force follow-up. That isn't super relevant, but it's just another way to use her, and you might honestly just be better off using like curtains if you wanted to use her in this manner. The tank builds are going to be what makes Thea shine. Next up is Duma. So because of his remix, he does now come with Fury 4, and I do think Fury 4 is quite a good skill for fodder, especially if you're running some sort of Wings of Mercy type teams, Gale Force teams, or just PvE teams with lots of follow-up. So do consider that. Now that we have his remix, we know that's what's going to happen for fodder. However, I feel like Duma is quite a good mythic, and at least keeping a single copy for the bonus mythic as in the defense season is relevant. Now, I do think the two best ways to use Duma post remix and refine are actually either A, you focus on his Fell Breath nuke and the attack checks that he has now, whether that's through Upheaval or Fell Breath, and you can just honestly keep Fury 4 in his A skill and use Life and Death in the seal. He's not going to win any Elemine checks this way, so it doesn't really matter that you dump his res and defense. The purpose of running like Life and Death is just to buff up that visible attack as much as possible and win those checks against your foes, so you deny their follow-ups and just hit really hard. Finally, you can challenge Elemines by doing a couple things. So if you do give him Fort Defense Res, you do give him Phantom Res 3 on the seal, and actually refine for Res Fell Breath instead of the effect, you can get him at a solid 44 base Res, and potentially that is 54 with Phantom Res. If you give Duma some flowers and some merges, then he can be quite competitive with Elemine on turn 1. So for those of you that have invested Dumas, that is potentially a good way to guarantee your upheaval from going off. And if you use him in this way, then Hardy Fighter also is going to be a good investment on him, because that'll just charge up Escutcheon or any of those defensive specials and make him just really irritating and difficult to kill. So I think Duma's in a much better spot now. I do think he's quite competitive with the other top defense, Anima defense mythic, which I would consider to be Mirabilis. Cyros and Odor are just kind of there to unlock the 7th slot, but they're littered through weaknesses, and I do think the utility on someone like Duma is in a way better spot than it was pre-remix, pre-refine, and of course, Elemine just potentially being challenged. Okay, next up is Idunn. Now, as I mentioned, I do feel she is probably the weakest of this batch, just because this refine doesn't really synergize really well with how you would want to use her. She doesn't have an auto double in her weapon. She does have the neutralized penalties, but it is kind of awkward how you would want to use her. For example, on the Summoner Duels build shown right here, there's no auto double for her on that weapon. You'd be forced to use something like Quick Riposte, or if you try to speed stack, the weapon refines effect, which is if the enemy can make a follow-up attack, starts getting less consistent, and that unfortunately is a problem. The thing as well is that Hardy Fighter denies enemy doubles, which then kind of makes the second effect, again, kind of weaker. So it's kind of weird, it's kind of anti-synergy. She's still a great tank, mind you, and I do think just using an air offense as far save or potentially near save, which isn't shown here, are still solid options if you use stuff like Crafty Fighter, Warding Breath. The best special that's damage-wise is unfortunately Glimmer, because there's no slaying. She's just missing some key components to be amazing, and unfortunately probably outclassed by Ascended Idunn, but it's still a good tank option for those of you that have emerged up or invested Idunn, regardless. In terms of fodder, she does have Fort Defense Res, which does find usage on plenty of units in this day and age, so you may want to consider foddering her instead of actually building her. I think this is more of a passion kind of favorite type unit that you would use, but not necessarily that meta relevant. If you guys think I'm missing anything, or you disagree, or you think, again, some builds that I just completely didn't think of, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Maybe I'm not being nice enough to Idunn. I just think that, again, competition between stuff like Arden, Black Knight, Halloween Myrrh, and just the fact that her weapon just didn't get good enough, or just didn't really change in a way that changed her playstyle, just feels kind of weak. Okay, next up is Kaden. Now remember, this weapon, Refine, does buff allies, gives them a guard effect, and a little bit extra defense and res. I do feel the best way to use Kaden is with HP. Now, hear me out. HP is quite a good stat for a couple of reasons. It lets you avoid sudden panic, it lets you avoid grav traps, it makes it more synergistic with how you would want to use someone like Kaden, where HP type effects, you don't really want them hitting Kaden. Panic banners again, sudden panics, grab traps, anything like that can be a big annoyance to somebody like Kaden. So stacking up his HP, I've shown HP attack here, but you can just honestly stack 2 HP 5s. And then on top of that, since he's a cav, he can use even pulse tie, cannot use sudden panic, but even pulse tie is a consideration to give him even more support capabilities. Either way, he's a support through and through, and that is how I would suggest using him. If you really wanted to use him in a more combat manner, then a Gale Force Wings of Mercy follow-up type build could work, I guess. He could also be technically Initiator with Trace, which isn't shown here, although I feel that's lacking, and maybe if a follow-up he supports and buffs others, but realistically, that's the only other way I could see him being used offensively. Alright, and the final unit of this refined batch is Gharnef. Now with Gharnef, I kind of like how this weapon is, but it is missing a few factors that make it consistent. The first one is, of course, that whole non-magic foe clause, which means that he's going to have really great matchups, but also pretty bad ones. It's really binary how he ends up being. The effect on his weapon, the base effect, didn't really change too much. It still pretty much procs flash, and it does a bit of damage. There is some synergy with someone like Kronia there, who might have some trouble initiating on teams and just having a bit of splash damage. And of course, on cleaning up the team, I do think someone like Gharnef is quite better than, like, let's say Fallen Takumi, because Fallen Takumi won't have as easy of a time, let's say, because that DR that Gharnef has, or just the flash effect, wind sweep types effect that Gharnef has in general. So in terms of like a cleanup and some soft support, Gharnef is pretty good, especially combined with Kronia, or just units who may want to initiate while Gharnef is in the back causing havoc. I guess fitting of the character himself. Stuff like Poison Strike and Savage Blow naturally synergize with him and just let him just splash all his damage on the team. If you wanted to give him more investment, you do want to again stack some HP because that works really well with his DR. His stats are all fairly balanced, and even Pulse Tie ends up being a great investment for HP supported units. He can also use Sudden Panic as well, so maybe consider that. Finally, he does have an option to be a ranged tank combined with, let's say, a near save armor. I think he works okay in this role, again, because he has built-in DR, and you can give him additional DR through Speed Smoke, which would be Speed DR, and that's going to increase his consistency as a ranged tank. Giving him Guard Effect through Kestrel Stance is good, or of course, now we have Kaden for that, and Null Follow-Up since he has a decent speed stat. He can work in this role, and that's the only kind of 3 ways I see him being used here. Maybe in Summoner Duels as some sort of long range, depending on the map, flash type character, but there's other characters who do that better with dual skills. Okay guys, that pretty much covers all our weapon refines of this batch in May. Some are quite interesting. Nobody's really a loser of this batch. Some of them are just less consistent or interesting, and I'd probably chalk that up to being Idunn. I honestly thought she'd get something better, but it's not bad. None of them really are bad. They're all quite good if you were using these characters. None of these are must-build type characters either. It's just if you're already using them, they're better. If you needed a certain role covered, let's say Kaden, supporting Omni tanks, or just far save, near save if you have the team slot for it, are all going to be quite useful. Thank you for watching as always. If you made it this far, I really appreciated you watching it through. Maybe consider checking out the Patreon description below if you want to support the content I do. Maybe coaching as well, again, description. I do one-on-ones and help out quite a few people get better at the game, wherever, whatever mode they want. And yeah, that's it for me, folks. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one. Much love. Peace.